I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I learn about him through everything I can find that he wrote and reading it in the chronological order as best I can tell that he wrote them. Today, I'm continuing in the collected letters of C.S. Lewis, edited by Walter Hooper, Volume 1. And we are starting the letters written in 1915. C.S. Lewis at this stage is 16 years old. His brother is in the Army Corps, Army Service Corps, I think is the name of it. And he is on the front in France in World War I. His brother, that is. C.S. Lewis is getting one-on-one tutoring with a former schoolmaster named W.T. Kirkpatrick, who takes on private tutors typically once a school year or something like that. And C.S. Lewis is enjoying his time with his tutor in his tutor's home with his tutor's wife and various guests that they either entertain or have come stay with them from time to time. So this first letter of 1915 is sometime around January 24th, written by C.S. Lewis to his father. And it says, "My dear Pappy, I have arrived and settled down here in due course, and everything progresses favorably, including the German. We had it snowing hard all day on Thursday, beautiful snow, and bright, frosty sun until Saturday, and are now enduring the thaw. Yes, I did change my socks. No, there are no holes in my shoes. Yes, thanks, I have plenty of warm underclothing. I hope you have by this time got rid of your cough, and I did not know the utter futility of so doing. I should advise you to be careful. However, as you will doubtless reply, my playing anxious adviser of a patient who will not obey orders is rather like Satan rebuking sin." Footnote. Actually, let's look at the first footnote. Albert Lewis, this is C.S. Lewis's father, like so many others, had for some months previously feared that England would be invaded by the Germans, and this explains why his son was not allowed to return to Great Bookham until the 16th of January 1915. So, just to reset the table, C.S. Lewis is from Belfast, Ireland. That's where his father lives at Lewis's childhood home. Lewis and his brother, relatively early in their lives, were sent away to boarding school in England, which was apparently a common practice for boys of that age at that time. But now that World War I has erupted, Albert Lewis, their father, was a little concerned, as we just read there, about potentially sending his son back into a country that might be invaded by Germany. But he did anyway. The footnote here where Lewis writes this about it is like Satan rebuking sin. He is referencing from the Gospels, Mark 3:26, "If Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand, but hath an end." One other thing I'll mention here is that Lewis returned to Ireland for the holidays, and during the holidays, he spent a week of that time getting confirmed in his hometown church. I believe it's an Anglican church, and some of the context that we read about last time is that Lewis, at that stage in his life, at age 16, no longer considered himself a believer, and so he was essentially putting on a show in this confirmation so that he didn't have to admit to his father that that's what was going on inside of him. So a little bit of conflict there. Let's see. And then he goes on to say, "But all joking apart, do take any care of yourself that you reasonably can, and don't refuse harmless precautions for no reason. That Smythe boy, the brother of the one who lost his arm, was home for a few days and lunched at Gaston's on Wednesday. Gaston's is where he's staying, where he's being tutored. He tells us that his brother is going out again as soon as he is better. So hard are we pressed that even cripples whose worth is known will be taken in some departments. What this argues as to the paucity of our troops in general and the old officers' contempt for the new volunteers who are to come, you will readily imagine. Smythe also directly contradicts the reports of the newspapers about the Indian troops whom he declares to be worthless and absolutely unfitted for trench fighting. They have, too, an unpleasant habit of not burying their dead, which contributes a good deal to the discomfort of European men anywhere near. But of course, this is only one man's story, and the longer this war goes on, the less credulous we become. Kirk has many amusing reflections, W.T. Kirkpatrick, his tutor, as usual, on the present crises, especially when the curate came in yesterday at afternoon tea and told a number of patriotic lies about Germany and the Germans. Kirk then proceeded with great deliberation to prove step by step that his statements were fallacious, impossible, and ridiculous. The rest of the party, including Mrs. K, Lewis, and myself, enjoyed it hugely. Lewis is Kirkpatrick and his wife's son. Thanks for my classical library, which I have received. In the course of the week, I shall return to Monroe's Iliad 1 through 12, which was not asked for. And the footnote here says this is the Iliad by Homer with an introduction, a brief Homeric grammar, and notes by D.B. Monroe. This was published in 1884. After which fact has been explained gently to Carson, you will tell his remains to give you in exchange Mary's Odyssey 1 through 13. That is Homer's Odyssey, books 1 through 13, with an introduction, notes, etc. by W. W. Mary, published 1870. Which was asked for. Okay, so he asked for one book, he got a different one, both of them by Homer, so given a mistake, I suppose. Kirk also tells me to ask for Tacitus's Agricola, any edition except Macmillan's Your Loving Son, Jack. That is a work by Cornelius Tacitus, who lived from 55 AD to 117, the greatest historian of ancient Rome. In AD 98, published Agricola, a biography of his father-in-law, Julius Agricola. Interesting. His next letter here is to his childhood friend Arthur Greaves. He writes again from Gaston's in Bookham, Surrey, England, where he is being tutored. He says, "My dear Arthur, I wonder would hunting be a good sport? The matter occurred to me not because I am really interested in it, but because I have just returned from a compulsory chase, trying to find out where the bit at the top of the page 2 of your letter was meant to come in. Now, faint and perspiring, I am enjoying the fruits of my labors. By this time, you will probably have finished Villette." What is Villette? Charlotte Bronte's work, Villette, published 1853. "What do you think of the ending? I can just hear you saying, 'Cracked, absolutely.' It certainly is most unsatisfactory, but yet a touch of genius. I fancy it is the only novel in existence that leaves you in a like uncertainty. Merriman is a far cry from the Brontes. Both, of course, are good, but while they should be sipped with luxurious slowness in the winter evening, he may be read in a cheap copy on top of a tram. And yet I don't know, of course, his novels are melodrama, but then they are the best melodrama ever written, while passages like Storm or the wreck in The Grey Lady or the reconciliation between the hero and his father in Edged Tools are as good things as English prose contains." Footnote here is that's Henry Seton Merriman that he's writing about. The Grey Lady is one of his works published in 1895, and With Edged Tools published in 1894. The remark about the Maiden Islands was really quite smart for you. You might have it framed. Also, such gems of orthography as sympathize and physically, which appeared in your last correspondence, though of course I, being almost as bad, have no right to complain. I guess he's making fun of his spelling, because he spells sympathize Sympathise, and he spells physically Pisically. And of course, these letters, as they're reproduced in this book, also include all of C.S. Lewis's spelling errors, intentionally, just to show the original, form of the letter. So he is, of course, talking about his own foibles as well in the spelling department here, with him being almost as bad, having no right to complain. He goes on to say, the weather here is perfectly damnable. There having been scarcely a couple of hours sunshine since I left home. Now that my friends have gone, there is nothing to do but sit and read or write when it rains, and consequently I have nearly finished the Morte d'Arthur. I am more pleased at having bought it every day, as it has opened up a new world to me. I had no idea that the Arthurian legends were so fine. The name is against them, isn't it? Malory is really not a great author, but he has two excellent gifts. One, that of lively narrative, and two, the power of getting you to know the characters by gradual association. What I mean is that although he never sits down, as the moderns do, to describe a man's character, yet by the end of the first volume, Lancelot and Tristan, Balin and Pellamore, Morgan Le Fay and Isolde are all just as much real, live people as Paul Emanuel or M.M.E. Beck. Paul Emanuel and M.M.E. Beck are characters in Villette, the work that he referenced earlier by Charlotte Bronte. The very names of the chapters, as they spring to meet the eye, bear with them a fresh, sweet breath from the old-time fairy world wherein the author moves. Who can read how Lancelot in the Chapel Perilous got a cloth from a dead corpse, or how Pellinore found a damsel by a fountain, and of the jousts in the castle of 4 stones, and not hasten to find out what it's all about? It's very interesting. You can see these influences, whether he intends them or not, in the way he titles the chapters of the Chronicles of Narnia. Let me see if I can quickly obtain a copy of those, just to give you an example. I think I have something that I can I easily access it in my book or in my phone? Let's find out. This will be faster if I just grab the copy. Yeah, so here's an example. Chapter 5 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Back on this side of the door. Let me look at the table of contents. See if there's anything more exciting than that. Diggory and Uncle, not necessarily. Maybe I've got bad examples. What happened at the front door? The fight at the lamppost, the founding of Narnia, the first joke and other matters. Lucy's look into a wardrobe. So yeah, you can see a little bit of him doing that here. The Hermit of the Southern March. Let me just see if I can find one or two more to see if there's like a really striking example. The Magician's Book, not so much. Here's one that's a little bit closer. The duffel puds made happy. And you can see a little illustration here of the duffel puds. I believe this is from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Anyway, just reminded me of that. Okay, so Mallory's influence on Narnia for you there. Excuse me. To obey my own theory that a letter should tell of doings, readings, and thinkings, I will conclude by saying I am trying to find some suitable theme for my Celtic narrative poem. There are heaps of stories, but mostly too long. Fairly well. Actually, I need to step away for just a second. I'll be right back. All right. That's the end of that letter. Is that the end of that letter? Let me see. To obey my own theory that a letter should tell of doings, readings, and thinkings, I will conclude by saying that I am trying to find some suitable theme for my Celtic narrative poem. There are heaps of stories, but mostly too long. Fairly well. Yours sincerely, C.S. Lewis. And I'm not sure what narrative poem this turns into. I have a book of his narrative poems, some of which I've read. Um, Maybe there's a footnote on this here, or it's referenced somewhere else. Anyway, he says, yours sincerely, C.S. Lewis. And then it says, in B, this was written on the same day as I got your letter, but I forgot to post it. Mille pardons, J. Uh, J, of course, is short for his nickname, Jack. The next letter is again to his friend Arthur Greaves, written from Gaston's on the 2nd of February, 1915. Dear Arthur, the first essential point of a letter writer to master is that of making himself intelligible to his reader. Or, to come down from my high horse, what was the it in brackets meant for? 1,000 pardons for my dullness, only I utterly failed to follow your wheeze. Please explain in your next epistle. I am deep in Morte Arthur by this time, and it is really the greatest thing I've ever read. It is strangely different from William Morris, although by subject and language they challenge comparison. One is genuine, and the other, though delightful, must, of course, be only an artificial reproduction. You really ought to read your copy of it, or at any rate parts of it, as the connecting chain between book and book is not very tightly drawn. I don't think it can be the library edition that those people have sent me, as it does not agree with your description at all, being bound in plum-colored leather with pale blue marker attached. However, partly through my keenness to read the book and partly because it was a very handsome binding, I did not send it back. By the way, is there anything the matter with my father, as I have not heard from him for some time now? Or perhaps it is only this submarine nonsense that makes the conveyance of letters uncertain, which reminds me that though I do not usually take much interest in the war, yet it would be unpleasantly brought home to me if I had to spend my holidays in England. Footnote here, there were in fact a good many German submarines operating in the Irish Sea at this time. Lewis's father was particularly upset over the raid near Fleetwood on January 30th, 1915, when the Germans sank the Kilcone, a collier designed by his brother Joseph. Yeah, his brother, I think, was a ship maker, an engineer. Uh, your remarks apropos of loneliness are quite true, and I admit that what I said before was rather not, as uncongenial companions produce in reality a worse desolation than actual solitude. I'm glad to hear you have read Esmond. It's one of my favorite novels, and I hardly know which to praise most, the wonderful musical Queen Anne English or the delicate beauty of the story. Let's see, this is William Marquis Thackeray's Esmond, 1852, that he's referencing. True, I did rather resent the history and still maintain that when a man sets out to write a novel, he has no right to ram a European war down your throat. It is like going back to Henty. Henty is George Henty, lived 1832 to 1902. While serving with the army in the Crimea, became a war correspondent. Following this career in many countries, he became successful as the author of stories for boys, mainly based on military history. Out of the Pampas, 1868, published 1868, was followed by some 35 other titles. So Lewis here is saying it feels more like a war correspondent has written a book rather than this author, William Makepeace Thackeray, in his work Esmond. And he goes on to say about Henty, the war correspondent turned author, did you ever try that arch fiend? I'm surprised that there is no snow in Ulster, as we had a week of good, thick, firm picture snow, and very much I enjoyed it, and other things too. She is better now, up and about, and we have progressed very rapidly. In fact, the great event is actually fixed. Fixed! Do you realize that? I don't think I've ever been so bucked about anything in my life. She's an awfully decent sort. Now, who is he talking about here? It says a family of Belgian refugees were evacuated to Great Bookham in autumn of 1914. Lewis began visiting them with Mrs. Kirkpatrick and became infatuated with one of the young girls in the family. He doubtless discussed his feelings for her with Arthur Greeves during the Christmas holidays. As to how much truth there was in what he wrote and said about the Belgian girl, see Lewis's letter of the 1st of October, 1931. Oh, wow, we've got several years to go to learn the rest of this story. Several letters and several years to come. But I suppose this is boring you, so I must cut short my raptures and my letter. Yours, Jack. The next letter to his father, written from Gaston's, postmarked the 3rd of February, 1915. My dear Pappy, as you will be by this time accustomed to my using this week as synonymous with next week, I will make no further mention of that matter than to say that the Iliad which you are to exchange is being sent by the same post as this. I must confess to extraordinary dullness in failing to catch any point, if point there be, in your remark, quote, now for a nasty one, end quote, or I found a Homer. Why a nasty one? The fact that you have begun to suffer from a mania for sending poor, unnecessary, unoffending books about the Channel is nothing which should disturb the peace of mind of the philosophers of Gaston's. I guess he's talking about himself and W.T. Kirkpatrick. Talking about the Channel reminds me of this morning's news. Of course, the really important feature of this submarine work is not so much the actual danger to goods and individuals as the inevitable scare which it will cause, and the injury to business arising from that. I suppose this was their intention. Sounds like what we would refer to as terrorism, or what some would refer to as terrorism. As for the Zeppelin talk, it seems to me to be rather childish folly on the part of the Germans. a few babies and an odd chimney stack cannot afford a recompense proportionate to the labor expense and danger of managing an aerial raid. The only point is the moral influence, which again depends entirely on the amount of guts of the victims. I am glad to hear that the new Kiplings are poems. I'm glad to hear that the new Kiplings are poems, as we have had none of them yet. The question as to whether he was a greater poet or prosier is one of those everlasting things. Perhaps, however, we may admit that someone else might possibly have written his best poems, but there is only one man alive who could have written Kim or The Jungle Books or Puck. This is a reference to Rudyard Kipling's Kim, published 1901, The Jungle Book, published 1894, the second Jungle Book, published 1895, and Puck of Pook's Hill, published 1906. I am not sure whether I have read The Seven Seas or not. It is there that the ballads about the prehistoric songman and Picture Man, the story of Ung, occurs. This is footnoted. Albert Lewis had just acquired Kipling's The Seven Seas, published 1896, which contains the story of Ung. I remember they made a very interesting criticism on artists and their public, ancient, and modern, and impressed me greatly. We've had one day of spring and are now paying for it by a wind and a rain that would take you off your feet. My German is progressing with such alarming success that I am rather afraid they will pull me under suspicious as a spy. Keep well, your loving son Jack. Next letter to his father, the 13th of February, 1915. My dear Pappy, as Spencer naively remarks at the beginning of about the 1000th canto of his poem, oh, what an endless work I have in hand. This is a reference to Edmund Spenser, The Fairy Queen, published 1590 and again in 1596, from Book 4, Canto 12, page 1. So might a parent doomed to supply an ignorant philosopher with the forgotten necessities of life echo the sentiment. Or in other words, there is still on the river to cross, and I really do think this will be the end. What I want is a copy of the Helena of Euripides. This is Helena, a play by the Greek poet Euripides, and it was produced in 412 BC, which you will find kicking its heels somewhere in the little end room. The shoes have just arrived, for which many thanks. And by the way, when I want to pay for anything, we'll let you know, boss. Don't worry. I am very annoyed that an opera company should come while I am away from home, although indeed it is a common enough state of affairs. Perhaps we are accustomed to regard John Harrison as an Horatio singer, and it would be rather a shock to hear him in an opera, although I have often seen records of him in operatic songs. I think you would be wise if you raised the energy to go. Perhaps Uncle Hamilton and Aunt Annie would take care of you. Do you think so? They must be having a rotten time at Glenmochan. Les Jeunes Maries, particularly, are making a bright start, aren't they? What one always feels about these troubles is that they are so hard on poor Bob. Bob is Lewis. He's mocking his cousin, Robert Hurd Ewart here, it says. Is it not cruel when a poor fellow is doing his best, working away at his music all night and slaving to make things bright and cheerful for everyone else, never letting his conversation flag, saving many a dull hour for Inu, and always unselfishly making his wishes subservient to the comfort of the household? Is it not hard that he should meet trouble like this? And yet you will hardly believe it. I have heard people so brutal as to suggest that this angel in the house ought to be at the front. Everything here is pretty much as usual. The weather is delightful, and Kirk's thoughts turn even lighter than of old to agriculture. His chief stunt at present is to point out the fact that he is the same age as Balfour. This is Mr. Kirkpatrick and Lord Balfour. They were both born in 1848, making them 67 at this point in time. And ask whether he would stand any chance of getting a job as headmaster now, and if not, is he to understand that the care of a few schoolboys calls for more qualities of youthful energy and intellect than that of the British Empire? Well, perhaps he's right. We have often heard him say so, at any rate. I've been reading this week a book by Swinburne from the library, A Study on Shakespeare. This is Algernon Charles Swinburne, A Study of Shakespeare, published 1880. This is my first experience of his prose, and I think I shall make it the last. Apt alliteration's artful aid may be all right in verse, but it is undoubtedly vicious in prose, as also are words like plenilune and melisonant and tautologous intromission, and yet at the same time, there is great force in the book, and his appreciation of the subject is very infectious. Your loving son, Jack. P.S. You might give the Colonel's address in your next letter, J. Letter to Arthur Greaves, dated 16th of February, 1915. Dear Arthur, when I received your epistle, which certainly did not weary one by its length, I was in one of my black moods. Like Saul, my evil spirit was upon me. This is, of course, a reference to, I say, of course, 1 Samuel 16:23. Quote, the evil spirit from God was upon Saul. I have felt this spirit a few times in my life. Having just had a sufficient glimpse of home and of my brother to tantalize but not satisfy, having lost, if not for good, at least for this term, an unparalleled opportunity, and finding a very objectionable visitor in possession of my grinder's house, you may well imagine that I was in no mood for an extra irritation. It says here that his brother Warren had only just returned from France, and having a week's leave, he and Jack spent part of it together at home. Jack then returned to Great Bookham on the 9th of February. Uh, I had just also been out for a walk. Mon Dieu, a nightmare, splashing through puddles beneath a leaden sky that rained and rained. However, enough of this. You ask me what was the matter with me when I was at home. Thank you. I believe I enjoyed excellent health. Of course, it is true that we saw a good deal more of our relations than we wanted, and had none too much time to ourselves. But of course, you or any member of your household are always welcome. As to the other grievance, it really is phenomenal ill luck. Of course, like all the rest of her sex, she is incapable of seeing anything fair, and when she had been persuaded after a good deal of difficulty to do this, and then I failed to turn up, it is only to be expected that I am left. In any case, it would be impossible now, as she has gone with her mother for a week to visit some other Belgians in Birmingham. Here it says, presumably the Belgian girl he had written about in his previous letter is who he's speaking of. I would presume that as well. But perhaps you are tired of my affairs. To go back to the question of holidays, I started to try and write an essay letter, but can't keep it up. Excuse me if I meander a bit. The last straw came on Sunday afternoon when we were snatching a few moments' rest before going off to visit our various relations. Who should walk in but, but Henry Stokes? Dear boy, how thoughtful of him, how kind. What a pleasure for us all. After that, my brother suggested that if ever he got another week's leave, we should spend it on the maidens. You must imagine me writing this in my bedroom at about 11 o'clock, as that damned guest makes it impossible to be comfortable downstairs. Although it was quite spring weather before I went home, a thin snow mixed with rain is falling outside. In spite of all my troubles, I am quite bucked with life tonight. And if only the water were hot enough for a bath, I should be in heaven. I wonder what you are doing just now. Which reminds me, you are drifting into a habit of morbid self-pity lately. All your letters are laments. Beware of the awful fate of growing up like that. I never, for my part, saw what was meant by such terms as the relief of confiding one's troubles and the consolations of sympathy. My view is that to mention trouble at all in a complaining way is to introduce into the conversation an element equally painful for everyone, including the speaker. Of course, it all depends on the way it is done. I mean, simply to mention them is not wrong, but by words or expression to call for sympathy, which your hearer will feel bound to pump up, is a nuisance. What a good friend I am to sit up writing all this stuff to a creature who, just because he doesn't feel like it, gives me no more than a couple of lines. Write soon, like a good friend, and tell me all about yourself and all the local gossip. I am damnably tired, and there's something the matter with the gas, and I've come to the end of my paper, so I must dry up. Yours, Jack. Next letter to his father, postmarked the 3rd of March, 1915, written from Gaston's. My dear Pappy, I hope this pause in your correspondence does not mean a pause in your health. It is now, in the words of the poet, a long time, in fact, a very considerable time, since your handwriting appeared on the hall table. One might write a paper on characters according to different days of the week. How a Monday table is associated with a letter from Arthur, and a Tuesday table with one from you. Although, as it would appear, sir, in this case, it has lately joined, quote, the inheritors of unfulfilled renown. This is footnoted as a reference to Percy Shelley Adonais, published 1821, chapter, can I read this? 55, page 397. Had to make out what that Roman numeral was. And become as blank and barren as its surly brothers of Saturday and Sunday. Of course, we would not forget Wednesday with its punch, or Thursday with its literary supplement, which is getting, by the way, poorer and poorer every week, like chalk, you know. Guess there was a shortage on chalk. I don't know that anything of world shaking importance has happened here. We have had snow and thaw alternately, with plenty of rain, wind, and frost thrown in to make things pleasant. Since Saturday, however, there has been some sunshine, and we are hoping for better things. The good ladies of Bookham still come regularly to tea, and I have the privilege of hearing what Mrs. Grant Murray would do if she were in Kitchener's place. This is Lord Kitchener, 1850 to 1916, and he was the Secretary of State for War. Interesting. And I get to hear all about Miss Milne's new maid. The discovery of German spies, too, is an art in which they excel. How I wish I knew enough German to let drop a few words occasionally, just as if I had slipped into it by accident. It is a great pity that Kirk won't come in to afternoon tea, as his commentaries on the whole cantata would be great. I essayed a new author the other day, whom we have often heard praised and of whom I hoped great things, Landor. But the book I got, a series of imaginary letters called Pericles and Aspasia, proved rather disappointing. This is Walter Savage Landor, Pericles and Aspasia, 1836 to 37, that he's referencing. And it proved rather disappointing. Indeed, I am afraid my appreciation of English prose is very limited, and I certainly cannot fatten on mere prose when the matter is not interesting. However, as the Colonel said in his essay on Kenilworth, the book is not wholly without merit. I forget whether you said you had ever read of him or not. This is Sir Walter Scott Kenilworth. This is Sir Walter Scott's work, Kenilworth, published 1821, that he's referencing. I suppose we must soon begin to make arrangements about the Easter holidays. I will not give up that spelling. However, there is no hurry, as the actual feast comes very late, and it is better to take off the summer term and add on to this. One might observe in passing, purely as a matter of general interest, of course, that we must by now have got past half term. Write soon if you are all right, and tell me all the gossip. Your loving son, Jack. P.S. That English word got ever struck you? In reading this letter, I couldn't help thinking of it. It is made to mean almost anything. Next letter to his father, around the 7th of March 1915 is when it was written, also from Gaston's. My dear Pappy, in the bad old days when I was still in the gall of bitterness at my school Malvern, we used sometimes to hear of schools that had a midterm holiday and congratulate ourselves on being superior to such cadata. But it proves to be no bad institution after all. Of course, it is short, but then how pleasant to feel at the end that one has only half a term to get through, and one appreciates a week at half term more than the same time in the middle of the holiday. I've not heard from the colonel since we parted at Euston, but I suppose he arrived in Sale all right, if that is how you spell it, Saille. The Gerald Smith, of whom I told you, who lost an arm in the war, was staying with us last week. He is really wonderful. He has only been out of bed about a month and is going back to the front again next week. It does one good to see a person thoroughly cheerful under circumstances like his and actually eager to be there again, even in so short a time. He has learnt to be quite independent and can cut his food, light his pipe, and dress, though how a man can tie a tie with one arm, I don't know. Did you read Lloyd George's speech the other day introducing the remark about the German potato bread? I fear that potato bread is more than all von Kluck's strategy. This is David Lloyd George, who lived 1863 to 1945, Minister of Munitions. He gave a speech on February 28th in which he appealed for an end to labor disputes. Quote, "We laugh at things in Germany," he said, "that ought to terrify us. We say, 'Look at the way they are making their bread out of potatoes. Ha ha! Aye, that potato bread spirit is something which is more to dread than to mock at. I fear that more than I do even von Hindenburg's strategy, efficient as it may be. That is the spirit in which a country should meet a great emergency. Instead of mocking at it, we ought to emulate it." This was published in the Times, the 1st of March, 1915, on page 10. He's asking his brother if he read this. Although, as you have seen, I don't often read the newspapers, I was glad when Kirk pointed out to me most of the people one hears rather laugh at that bread wheeze, but I rather think Lloyd George's is the wiser view. In the way of reading, I have been taking a course of poems and ballads, which, with the exception of the Coin of a Cliff, I had almost forgotten. Coin of a Cliff. It says here, these are poems by Charles Swinburne, Poems and Ballads, second series, 1878. The poem entitled A Forsaken Garden begins with "In a coin of the cliff beside or between the lowland and the highland." So that's the poem that he's referencing. I had almost forgotten. It is rather pleasant to discover a book which is already at home for future use. The weather here is very miserable, and I don't think there's been an hour's sunshine since I came back. Kirk asked me to write for Enid uh, 7 and 8, published at 1/6 each by Cambridge University Press, edition Sedgwick. This is the Enid of Virgil, book 8, edited with notes and vocabulary by Arthur Sedgwick, published 1879. I am afraid these requests for books are rather numerous, but of course it is Kirk's to command, mine not to question, not to question why, etc. I have heard nothing from you now since the holidays, except the scant note of which you so rightly said, "This is not a letter." I sincerely hope you are not hors de combat. Hors du combat. Do drop me a line soon and let me know. Your loving son, Jack. Next letter to his father, written around March 21st, 1915, from Gaston's. My dear Pappy, in connection with the question before the House, I have, as you may have anticipated, only one answer. Apart from the natural inclination to go home, if possible, it occurs to me that there is no knowing where such a period of non-homecoming might end. If we could be sure that this policy of frightfulness would be over by midsummer, I should not hesitate to spend Easter in England. But it would be illogical to stay here now on account of the submarines and cross then in spite of them. so that there is the frightful prospect of living on opposite sides of the channel for 2, 5, or 6 years. That, of course, is unthinkable, and it is on that ground chiefly that I should recommend going home. A minor point to be considered is that it would be as well to make use of my return ticket while it is still available. The same idea would make me inclined to travel by Fleetwood, for which my ticket is available, in preference to Larne and Stranraer. The difference in length of the crossing is, I should say, by no means commensurate with the extra expense, and in comfort, Fleetwood is probably superior. If these ideas fall in, if these ideas fall in at all with your own, I should suggest that I leave Bookham on Thursday week, the 1st April, which would mean arriving home on the morning of Good Friday. That just leaves a comfortable space of time in which you can write to Kay about it. Last weekend was busily employed in reading through De Quincey's Confessions. This is Thomas De Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1822 was the publication date. Employed in reading through De Quincey's Confessions as a whole for the first time, which I derived great satisfaction. How much of it is true? The whole thing reads so like a novel that I am rather incredulous. Anyway, it is certainly a splendid piece of English prose, especially in the rhetorical passages where he shows such a happy knack of getting pleasantly off the point. Thanks for the Aeneids, though with the holidays near, or the Aeneids, maybe that's how you say it. Aeneids. I think I pronounced it right earlier when it was footnoted. Thanks for the Aeneids, though. With the holidays near, if I had thought, I might have let it stand over. As you say, our inability to cope with the submarine menace is a very serious thing, but not half so far reaching, so degrading, so essentially rotten as the behavior of our working classes, who, though so highly paid that they can afford to have 3 days off per week when nominally at work, yet because of some petty jealousies of their own, are refusing to turn out the goods necessary to the military operations which the country is engaged upon. As Kay points out, we are the only country which, when the war broke out, was free from militarism and yet about to engage in civil war, and we are now the only one that cannot secure peace among its working classes. But enough of this. The weather, as usual, of late is disgusting, except for one pet day on Sunday. I hope to see you next week. Your loving son, Jack. His next letter is to Arthur Greaves, actually, his next two. Let me see if I can knock both of those out before I have to go. Yeah, I'll shoot for both of those, and then I'll stop. To Arthur Greaves, dated March 30th, 1915. From Gaston's. Dear Arthur, how I pity you people who never have known the pleasures and the pains, which are an integral part of the pleasures, of a regular interchange of homecoming and school going. Even the terrors of Malvern were almost justified by the raptures with which one hailed the periodic deliverance. Huh. That section, that passage right there just reminded me of a part from The Problem of Pain, where he talks about well, I don't know how much this really ties to it, but just the idea that you can't appreciate the highs without the lows is obviously what he's covering there. But there's a section in The Problem of Pain where Lewis talks about how sometimes uh, pain can have a little bit of pleasure in it based on the level of intensity. So if you get the closer that you get to a fire, the more painful it becomes. But as you're just edging right up to it, it starts to feel more and more comfortable. So I'm reminded of that in this passage, but that's not really what he's talking about in this passage. Here, where the minor disadvantages of my sojourns at Bookham are just enough to act as a foil to the pleasures of home, but not so great as to make the earlier part of the term unhappy. The arrangement is ideal. The satisfaction with which a day boy looks forward to a period of rest from his work can be but the faintest shadow of a boarder's feeling toward his return from temporary exile. So, of course, at the old boarding schools that he would attend, there were some people, obviously, it's a boarding school, who lived there and then would go home at the end of term. But there were other students who lived local to the area at home and then would go to that school during the day. So, them just returning home, he's saying, is just for the day, is just a shadow of how great it feels to be done with a term and go home and not have to live off at school. These last few days, every little nuisance, every stale or tiresome bit of work, every feeling of that estrangement with it, which I never quite get over in another country, sir. Wow, these seeds of hope that he's talking about is really neat. Already one's mind dwells upon the sights and sounds and smells of home, the distant murmuring of the yards, the broad sweep of the lough, the noble front of the cave, the noble front of the cave hill, and the fragrant little glens and breezy meadows of our own hills, and the sea. I cannot bear to live too far away from it. At Belfast, whether hidden or in sight, still it dominates the general impression of nature's face, lending its own crisp flavor to the winds and its own subtle magic to horizons, even when they conceal it. A sort of feeling of space and clean, fresh vigor hangs all over in a country by the sea. How different from the stuffiness of Bookham. Here, the wind, that is to say, the true, brisk, boisterous, irresistible wind, never comes. And yet, I would not for a moment disparage the beauty here of Surrey. These slumbering little valleys and quaint farmsteads have a mellow charm of their own, which Ulster has not. But just now, my end of term feelings will not allow me to think of that. But why, you will ask, am I treated to these lyrical raptures? Indeed, sir, I hardly know. My father wrote a few days ago and asked if we should risk the submarines and come home or not. I, of course, said that we should, advancing many sage arguments thereto, and suggested leaving here next Friday. I have not been answered yet, but hope to goodness it is coming off. Anyway, a wave of end of of terminus came over me tonight, and as I had to communicate with someone, so you, poor fellow, get let in for this. I had a letter from her the other day, which is all satisfactory. Must shut up now. The her, of course, I'm guessing he's referencing is the Belgian girl that he has an affection for, an affinity for. Let's see what the footnote says. Yeah, it just says, i.e., the Belgian girl. Yours, Jack. An editorial note here. Jack arrived in Belfast for his Easter holidays on April 1st and was there till April 30th. During this time, he wrote the first poems he considered worthy of preservation. One of those written during this holiday was The Hills of Down, and it is found in his collected poems published 1994. From this same time until he went up to Oxford in 1917, Lewis wrote 52 poems, which he copied into a notebook bearing the name Metrical Meditations of a Cod. 14 of the metrical meditations are found in his published work, Spirits in Bondage. I need to make a note of the collected poems published 1994. I don't know if those are on my reading list. Let me go over here and look real quick. Here, I'll let you see what I'm looking at. Share screen. Let's share this. Share. Yeah. Do I have it in here? Collected poems. Let's take a look. Nope, just the collected letters. So 1994. Let's put it right here. Collected poems. 1994. There we go. Just a little housekeeping on the fly. Stop screen share. Okay. Let's see. Last letter, and then I'll end for today. This one's also to Arthur Greaves, dated May 4th, 1915. Dear Galahad, Lewis had borrowed the name from Mallory in Le Morte d'Arthur. Galahad is the son of Lancelot and Elaine, and destined because of his immaculate purity to achieve the Holy Grail. Dear Galahad, I am surprised. Have you actually come down to enjoying such stuff as The Breed of the Treshams? He's referring here to John Rutherford's The Breed of the Treshams, published 1903. I never, for which the gods be thanked, saw or read it, but the name is enough. I admit I should like to have seen The Shrew. This is William Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew from 1623. I would like to have seen The Shrew, and novelties in the way of staging are always rather interesting. I must prefer on the stage, and everywhere for that matter, quite tasteful, plain decorations to tawdry, splendid things. I feel my fame as a man about the gramophone greatly put out by your remarks apropos of Lohengrin Prelude Act 3. He here is referencing Richard Wagner's opera Lohengrin, and it was first performed in 1850. As I must confess, I never heard of it on Columbia. I do hope it is a good record, as I should like to have it very much. What is the Vinsbury music like? Here he is talking about the title Richard Warner had chosen for his opera, The Winsberg, but he changed it to Tannhauser when he learned that certain wits were making a joke of it. The opera was first performed in 1845. What is the Vinsbury music like? Is it that wild part that comes at the end of the Tannhauser overture? Of course, you know the Columbia edition of Schubert's Rosamund. 30. So let's see. The fire music is what he's referring to here. It's the interlude to Act 3, Scene 3 of Richard Wagner's opera Die Valkyrie, or The Valkyrie, first performed in 1870 and part of his Ring of the Nibelung cycle. It has long been at Little Lee. Of course, you know the Columbia edition of Schubert's Rosamund has long been at Little Lee. But when last I played it to you, I seem to remember a non-favorable verdict from you. I am so glad that you have gotten, that's correct, you know got, isn't it? I guess this was a novelty, or uh, a novelty in the English language to start using got and gotten. I'm so glad that you have gotten, that's correct, you know got, isn't, the fire music. The fire music I just read about, actually. I read that footnote a little early. As I've been hesitating over it for ages, and your success or failure will decide me. Oh, I had better stop writing about this, as it makes me think long. Not, if you please, in a sentimental way, but with a sensible desire for my books, and you, and our gramophones, etc. For information on music recorded, this is a footnote. For information on music recorded on gramophone records, see Francis F. Clow and G.J. Cuming, The World's Encyclopedia of Recorded Music, published 1952. However, I have gotten, notice again, gotten, one great addition to my comfort here in the discovery of a soaking machine, which conveniences are very scarce in England, owing to the strict customs which prevent the mildest trespassing. My new palace is at the foot of a great oak, a few yards off a lane, and hidden therefrom by a little row of shrubs and small trees, completely private, safe from sun, wind, or rain, and on the ridge of the only rising ground, you wouldn't call it a hill, about here. There, with a notebook and pencil, I can be as free to write, etc., as at home. So if your next letter comes in pencil on a sheet torn from a pocketbook, you needn't be surprised. I must find some more of these places as summer goes on, for it is already too hot to walk far. I bought yesterday a little shining book about W.M. Morris, his life and his work. This is a book by Arthur Clutton Brock called William Morris, His Work and Influence, published 1914, which is rather interesting, to me at least, for I am afraid you have given up that old friend of ours. To say that you have something sentimental to say, and then not to say it, is to be like Janie McInn, This is Janie Agnes McNeil, or Janie Agnes McNeil, lived 1889 to 1959. She was the daughter of James Adams McNeil, headmaster of Campbell College from 1890 to 1907. Campbell College, I believe, is a school in Ireland that Lewis attended, I think, for 1 year of his life outside of boarding schools and where he's being tutored now in England. He was the headmaster of Campbell College, her father, and Margaret Cunningham McNeil. Mr. McNeil had at one time been Flora Lewis's teacher, and he and his wife and daughter lived near the Lewises in Lisnadine at 191 Belmont Road, Strandtown. Of course, Flora Lewis is C.S. Lewis's now dearly departed mother. When he was young, C.S. Lewis both liked and disliked Janie. As time went on, he realized that Jane, who would have liked to have gone to university, had remained home to look after her mother. He came to admire her much, and in time they became devoted friends. He was also close to Mrs. McNeil, whose company he greatly enjoyed. His book, That Hideous Strength, is dedicated to Janie. You can see her biography in Companion's Guide, which is another work by Walter Hooper, which I don't think I have, but I should probably get. Let's see. To say that you have something sentimental to say and then to not say it is to be like Janie McNeil with the latest scandal that everyone is told about and no one is actually told. I don't quite follow your letter in places. What is the connection between all the rubbish about, quote, that nuisance Arthur? You know how all your friends ridicule and dislike that sort of talk. And the wish that I should become sentimental perforce. By the way, I am perhaps more sentimental than you, but I don't blow a trumpet about it. Indeed, I am rather ashamed of it. Feelings ought to be kept for literature and art, where they are delightful and not intruded into life, where they are merely a nuisance. Wow. I could see what he's talking about here, where Arthur was teaching him how to be charitable and how he was very charitable with Lewis. I've just finished Shirley, which I think better than either Jane Eyre or Villette. Jane Eyre, of course. Well, where is it? There's a footnote here. Charlotte Bronte's Shirley, 1849, and then Jane Eyre is work published in 1847. You must read it. What a letter. Every sentence seems to begin, I. However, a good healthy dose of egotism is what you need, while you might pass on a little of your superfluous modesty to Bookham. Sorry, you've returned the old Meister singers. Well, that last sentence shows me that he's at least a little bit self-aware. However, a good healthy dose of egotism is what you need, while you might pass on a little of your superfluous modesty over here to Bookham. Sorry you've returned to the old Meister singers, but think of the Bika better value. Yours, Jack. Let's see what the footnote here is on that. Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg was an opera by Richard Wagner, and it was first performed in 1868. And then he says, postscript, what is the name of the Galloping Horse piece by Chopin? I want to make Mrs. K play it. Mrs. K, of course, is his tutor, Mr. Kirkpatrick's wife, who played the piano, but she didn't do it as frequently as Lewis liked, and so he wants to encourage her to play a piece. The Galloping Horse by Chopin. It says here in a footnote that Arthur did not seem entirely sure what this Galloping Horse piece was. In Lewis's next letter of May 11th, he said to Arthur, why didn't you give me the number of the Polonaise? And what cheek to say, I think it is in A flat, when a journey downstairs would make it sure. If he had looked carefully, Arthur might have discovered that it was not one of Chopin's Polonaises, but one of his mazurkas. And I do not know close to enough about music and Chopin to know what makes what a polonaise is versus a Mazurkas and what the distinction is between the two. But I'll stop there, and until my next read on C.S. Lewis, take care of yourself.